So we hear a story of Shiphrah and Puah this morning. Shiphrah and Puah make very short appearance in the biblical text. In fact, what we just heard is all we hear about them. But they fundamentally alter the trajectory of our sacred stories. It's just a few short verses at the beginning of Exodus, but without these two women, there would be no Exodus story. And so, though our experience of them is fleeting, they are crucial women in our story of faith. We meet them here in the book of Exodus, the story that tells about the Israelites' presence, the Hebrew presence in Egypt, and the story of their epic return. We hear about them at the very beginning of the story, when the descendants from Joseph, remember him with his multicolored coat, and his brothers, who he's brought to Egypt, it says in the verse preceding, were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. There's a whole sermon there about the fear of strangers coming into somebody's land, our land, multiplying and feeling overwhelmed by them. And Pharaoh did feel overwhelmed by them. He feared that the Hebrew people were growing so great in number that if war were to break out, they would turn against the Egyptians. So he felt like he had to do something about this. First, he tries harsh forced labor for all Hebrews in Egypt, thinking that that will wear out their bodies or that will slow them down, but it does not. So then he turns to this murderous decree. He summons these two midwives, and we're not clear whether they are of Hebrew descent, serving Hebrew women, or of Egyptian descent, serving Hebrew women. But he calls these two midwives. And it's important to understand that they were unlikely like a couple of random midwives. Two midwives did not serve the entire birthing population of the Hebrew people at that time. Will Gaffney, professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School, calls them likely mothers or heads of the Israelite midwifery guild. And I'm using Hebrew and Israelite interchangeably here. So he summons these heads of the midwifery guild, and he gives them this genocidal mandate. When you are helping the Hebrew women give birth, and you see the baby being born, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, you can let him live. The supposition being the population would gradually dwindle without hurting the need for forced labor too much, and the population would become integrated into the Egyptian population through intermarriage. But Shiphrah and Puah, it tells us, fear God. They feared God. So they didn't obey the Egyptian king's order. Instead, they let the baby boys live. This word is important for us to understand a little bit. This word, feared God. It's not a word that we love in our translations because we have heard so much emphasis on fearing God in our society, and that's used in a way that has hurt so many of us. But it's translated elsewhere as respected God. And this particular word, it shows up a lot in the Psalms. And it sort of encompasses a whole range of feelings: to fear, to shudder at, to be in awe of, to revere, to hold in honor. The word is used again and again for the appropriate response of the people to God's presence. In Psalm 139, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. It's the same word. Psalm 130, forgiveness is with you, that's why you are honored. It's the same word. Be not afraid. Do not be afraid. We hear that refrain again and again. It's this word again. So the midwives were in awe of, they respected, They shuddered in front of God. And what we're to understand with that is that their loyalties, their devotion was to God, not to Pharaoh. Because Pharaoh was understood to be a god. Pharaoh was not just a government ruler. Pharaoh was a god. So when we are told that the Shiphrah and Puah were in awe of God, their allegiance and loyalty is to the God of our people, of the Bible. So they defy his barbarous order and let the Hebrew boys live. But of course, Pharaoh sees that baby boys continue to be born, and he calls them back. I just can't even imagine how frightening and intimidating this had to be. This man had the ultimate power over their lives, their families' lives. There's all kinds of terrible things that he could have done, and he is not happy. They have disobeyed this order. And we hear in the text it says, they tell him the reason there are all these baby boys, Hebrew baby boys still alive, bouncing around, is because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. And the word that it is used is vigorous in the translation, but some other words are stronger or lively. It turns out that the actual word that they said is, the Hebrew women are like animals. They're like animals. They just give birth like that before we can get there. So they use Pharaoh's own underestimation of women giving birth and of the Hebrew people, and they kind of slide in and they use that negative association that he already has to trick him. This is one of those tricky things with translations. If you read that, you would think, oh, that's a terrible way of describing them. But in fact, it's an essential part of the story. They used a slur to help trick this powerful man. They used his own prejudice, his own presuppositions about a people and about a gender to trick him. Without the literally life-giving submersiveness of Shiphrah and Puah, there would be no Moses. There would be no exodus for the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. There would be no trek through the wilderness to the promised land of Canaan. Shiphrah and Puah had the courage and audacity to defy these deadly orders of a very powerful king. And through that act of defiance, an entire nation was saved. Today is the first Sunday, as Kelly mentioned, when we are celebrating the ways in which our church is changing lives. And thank God we do not live in a time under a ruler God who can order infanticide. But sometimes it does feel like we are living in a world where death's fingers try to creep in and claim life. It feels that way when injustice to a people long ignored surges into horrific violence. It feels that way when horror is responded to with even greater violence, with the force of an army behind it and their weapons. It feels that way when our money is being funneled toward supporting this violence. Death's fingers. When we hear yet another alarming climate record set and leaders do nothing. When we learn about the loopholes and benefits provided to the mega rich and read about assistance and aid being cut to the many, many poor among us. When we learn about a tragedy that has been unfolding on the other side of the world that we have not even heard about because their lives aren't deemed worthy of reporting. Death's fingers drumming on the table. Feels that way closer to home sometimes too. When we learn of another queer teen struggling with suicidal thoughts, sometimes amidst our own congregation, and witness at the same time the backlash to little pride flags being flown in downtown Poulsbo. When we drive by an encampment providing shelter for the homeless, or perhaps worse than that, after an encampment has been razed, with all of that person's belongings put into the dumpster. When the feelings of despair at the world begin to overwhelm our brains. Death's fingernails scrabbling for purchase on our hearts. Shiphrah and Puah lived in a time and a place where death was not nibbling, but taking ravenous bites. I cannot imagine their despair. Midwives are trained to assist women in coaxing life forward. And here they were being commanded to bring death with them to each delivery. In the midst of this, they found a thread of resistance, a thread that they pursued and spread. Their awe, their respect, their honor of the divine force that dwells in us all pushed them to resist, pushed them to be bringers of life, not death. Unwilling to allow those death fingers any purchase, they pushed back in ways that they could, using creativity, solidarity, subversiveness. They couldn't do everything. They couldn't keep Pharaoh from enslaving their families and neighbors. They couldn't prevent the generations of tribulations that the Israelites would experience in the land of Egypt. But they could do this one thing, a thing that was at once a small thing in the face of all of the things, but was everything to each laboring mother they attended. Our small church, on the corner of a small village on the peninsula of the Pacific Northwest, cannot do everything. We cannot stop the violence around the world. We cannot stop white Christian nationalism from gaining ground. We cannot solve the homeless crisis or soaring housing prices or climate change. But we can resist. In the small ways that we can, in the ways that are in our sphere of influence and control, we can push back against the fingers of death. A narrative that tells us it's always been this way and it always will, so why bother? We can tend a beautiful sanctuary in our backyard, watering and pruning and mowing and weeding and picking up dog poop, so that when your pastor is asked, can we host an interfaith vigil in less than 24 hours, she can say, yes, let's gather at the labyrinth. And so tonight we will open up our backyard and labyrinth to an interfaith candlelight vigil for people to gather and mourn and be in community in this hard time. We can show up to our Undoing Racism Learning Group month after month, even after the world has moved on from the summer of racial reckoning, working to chip away first at our own understanding and then our divestment of our embedded messages of Christian superiority and white supremacy, so that when issues of racism surface in our own local school district, we can boldly and prophetically proclaim a witness against it. We can work with sometimes unpredictable volunteers, and we can shop the food sales, and we can navigate relationships that can be challenging because people are challenging, so that when a hungry kid checks out our pantry on their way home from school, or a lonely senior rolls their walker in on Wednesdays, they are met with hospitality and grace that reminds them, in the face of a world that tells them otherwise, of their belovedness. We can study our own sacred text so that we understand the ways in which It is complicated and nuanced and life-giving, claiming its message of liberation and love for all people, so that we can resist the ways in which it is used as a weapon against the Jewish people, against queer people, so that we can resist the way that it's been used in order to build a world that is a safe harbor for them, at least in our reach. We can commit our resources and our time and our hope to one another in covenant, working through our occasional disagreements and frustrations that surface, gathering regularly for worship and meetings and craft sessions, so that in times of great joy and great sorrow, we can come to this place as a sanctuary, and we can open our doors to others who desperately need that sanctuary. Might not feel enough on weeks like today. Might never feel like enough. But my guess is that Shiphrah and Puah felt like it wouldn't be enough either. They knew that the murderous Pharaoh would find another way, but it was something they could do. And so they did it. Our church steadily, faithfully finds what we can do, and we do it. It is not enough, and yet it is everything. It is not enough, and yet those whose lives we change because of it, it is life-giving. It is not enough, and yet in the doing of it, we enact, we engage in the courageous, life-giving practice of resistance. And we find that we change our own lives. Because of you, our church changes lives. Thanks be to God.